Hello, my friends. I hope you're all doing well. Today is Friday, the 28th of November, and this is my only update for today. With each and every passing day, the situation in Europe gets more and more tense because now the European leaders are ramping up the pressure on Mr. Bard, the Belgian Prime Minister, because he's still refusing to unlock the frozen Russian assets in order for the EU to just give it to Ukraine. But Mr. Bardover, he's not just standing there and take it. Oh no, he's pushing back in a big way. Now, I would argue that what he does is just saying the quiet part out loud. He's saying what most of us are probably thinking. Also, we have Vladimir Putin. Ever since the United States has put a 28-point peace plan on the table, it's for the first time when Vladimir Putin personally is addressing the issue. Also, speaking of Ukraine, well, apparently the Russians have made a breakthrough down south next to Julia Pol. Then there's the Wall Street Journal who tells us that Germany has a secret plan for an eventual war with Russia. Like I said, the situation only gets more tense in Europe. But with that said, I suggest we start with Vladimir Putin with one of his first statements, because this one technically should put the Europeans at ease, right? It should address the European concerns. You'll see what I mean in a second. So, without any further ado, let us just go to Ukraine Caprata, the beacon of democracy, and let's see what Vladimir Putin is saying. Putin offers to state in writing that Russia has no plans to attack Europe. Quote, "It is one thing to say that Russia is not going to attack Europe. For us, that sounds ridiculous. It really does. We have never intended to. But if they want to hear it from us, well, fine. We will put it in writing. No problem." Now, you would imagine that these words would be very well received in virtually every single European capital. I mean, at face value, what's not to like about it? What Vladimir Putin is essentially saying is that, look, Russia is willing and ready to give Europe security guarantees. That's what putting it in writing actually means. Now, this might be fantastic news for the European people, but what do you do with the European leadership? Because you see, for the EU leaders, it is absolutely essential that the Russian threat stays alive, that the Russian threat doesn't go anywhere, just as it was essential for NATO that the Soviet threat stayed alive even 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. We've been here before. We've seen this movie in the past, and we know how it ended. It ended with a war, with the war in Ukraine. Now, some people still argue, well, look, Seb, why do you keep saying all the time that it's essential for the EU leaders that the Russian threat stays? Well, let me put it this way. How else do you think the EU leaders would be able to justify all of those hundreds of billions of euros which have been just thrown into the wind, or the permanent damage which has been done to the European economies, or the deindustrialization of Germany, how about that one, or the censorship which has descended upon Europe? These are just some of the things that will be very hard to explain without the Russian threat being present. Just keep something in mind. Most of the big EU leaders are sitting at around 30, 20, 10% approval ratings. And I think it's obvious why the Russian threat is the glue that keeps this entire sham together. Call. Nevertheless, if this has already been whipped up in the public mind, if they have frightened their citizens and want to hear that we're not going to and have no aggressive plans towards Europe, then fine. We are ready to set this down any way they like. Well, let's face it, Vladimir, that ain't gonna fly. Not in Brussels. Because for some of the EU leaders, the only thing that would suffice is Russia's full and unconditional capitulation, regardless of how realistic that is. With that said, speaking of the EU leaders, they're having a huge challenge ahead of them. One which they have not accounted for, and that is the position of the United States, or shall I say the position of Donald Trump. Let me explain what I mean. During the Joe Biden administration, the EU leaders were in a sheltered position. Why? Well, because Joe Biden was willing to take center stage to drive this train forward with money, with political support, with sanctions on Russia, et cetera, et cetera. However, Donald Trump, at least at face value, he seems to want to de-escalate the tensions with Moscow. Maybe not entirely, but certainly to a degree. And that leaves the European leaders exposed, because if they want to keep pressure on Russia really high, well, they have to do it themselves with their own means. And to say that the political might of the EU leaders is not as big as the United States, I think that is an understatement. That might be the understatement of the century. The bottom line is they can't do it alone. Also, what do you do with the next question? If the United States says to the U.S. people, look, folks, we've struck a deal with Russia. There's no more Russian threat. Nothing to worry about. How do you think the EU leaders will manage to sell this Russian threat to the European people? Do you see the problem here? This is why the EU leaders are furious with Donald Trump's approach. Putin says he cannot negotiate peace with Zelensky. Quote, of course, in the end, we want to reach an agreement with Ukraine, but right now it is practically impossible legally. Putin claimed that signing documents with the Ukrainian leadership is pointless. Quote, I believe the Ukrainian leadership made a fundamental strategic mistake when it was afraid to hold presidential elections, after which the president lost his legitimate status. I'm not going to elaborate too much on this topic since I've already discussed this at length. I mean, it's nothing new. The Russians have been saying this since, I think, May last year. The point is, they still have the same exact position. And with that said, let me now take you over to the European, or to the scandal in Europe with Mr. Bard and the European leaders. This is an interesting read. EU allies turn screws on Belgium over its tax income from Russia's frozen assets. Listen to this. European governments are piling pressure on Bard to allow the Russian cash to go to Kyiv as a mega loan. These people, they're still calling it a loan. Let me give you two numbers. In 2024, Ukraine's GDP was at around 164 billion euros, give or take. Also, Ukraine's debt to GDP ratio was at around 90%. Now, the loan, which the EU wants to give Ukraine, the Russian frozen assets, is worth of around 140 billion E. Now, that would put Ukraine's debt to GDP ratio at almost 200%. Now, my question to you is, how long do you think it would take Ukraine to repay that money back? I mean, the United States, by comparison, has a debt to GDP ratio of around 120%. And we know what kind of strain that puts on the U.S. economy, which is why each and every year they have to keep increasing the debt ceiling. It's like chasing your own tail now. And that's the United States, the most powerful country on earth, the country with the biggest economy. What do you think this would do to Ukraine? It's just a simple question, but they're still insisting on the wording alone. Frustrated EU countries are ramping up pressure on Belgium to release the 140 billion euros of frozen Russian reserves held in Brussels by accusing Bardever's government of failing to fully disclose what he does with the tax income from those immobilized assets. In other words, they're going after Mr. Bardev in whichever way they can. But as I said in the intro of the video, he's not just sitting there and take it. Oh no, he's pushing back. Listen to what he replies. Belgium's Deve dials up opposition to Russian frozen assets deal. The Prime Minister's strongly worded intervention dashes EU hopes that the breakthrough on sending assets held in Belgium to Ukraine could be imminent. Quote, hastily moving forward on the proposed reparations loan scheme would have as a collateral damage that we as EU are effectively preventing reaching an eventual peace deal, David wrote in the letter. And of course, he's entirely correct, because we all know that this money would be used in order for Ukraine to purchase weapons. I mean, do you remember the statements from Emmanuel Macron, who said, well, look, if we finally give Ukraine this money, we need to make sure that Ukraine purchases European weapons. So this is money used for weapons. So as Mr. Bard ever says, this would only intervene as an obstacle in the way of a peace deal. Doesn't that make sense? Now listen to what he says about the Russians. Quote, in the very probable event Russia is ultimately not officially the losing party, it will, as history has shown in other cases, be legitimately asking for its sovereign assets to be returned. Dever continued in the letter. Reading between the lines, Mr. Dever is saying, look, Russia is not losing this war, and inevitably they will come knocking, asking for their own money back. This is why Belgium asked the rest of the EU to give them financial guarantees. Listen to this. Restating his traditional position, the Belgian leader said he would agree to the loan only if governments agree to immediately stump up the full amount if Russia reclaims the assets. Quote, I will not agree unless these guarantees, as stipulated above, are delivered and signed by member states at the time of decision, he wrote. And that's only fair. isn't it? If the EU member states are putting pressure on Belgium to release these assets, telling Belgium, look, nothing bad's going to happen. Well, why are they not willing to pony up the money in case something does happen? This is just like me and Jimmy sitting on a cliff's edge. And I say to Jimmy, why don't you take the next step over? And Jimmy says, well, I'm not comfortable doing that. Why don't you do it first, Seb? And I say, no. You do it. I'm just going to sit here and watch, but I promise you everything's going to be okay. This is exactly the analogy that describes this sham right there. Russian troops entered flank near Julia, and this is a statement which comes from Vladislavson, spokesman for the Defense Forces of Ukraine South. Quote, our troops carried out a regrouping, and their defensive structure was rearranged in order to preserve personnel and strengthen the defense of Julia. However, one of the units withdrew from its positions on its own without clearing it with the command. This exposed one of the flanks of our operational line in the area, leaving the personnel of the neighboring unit without any cover. The Russians took advantage of the situation and challenging weather conditions to attack the Ukraine Defense Forces flank. This right here comes just days after the disaster of Pokrovsk-Nograt. Last night, Alex from History Legends has posted a video in which he talked about the full encirclement of the Ukrainian unit. The point I want to emphasize is this. Over the last 4 years, the collective West has given to Ukraine every single military support they could have given. They've given artillery, shells, ammunition, long-range strikes, planes, jets, whatever. None of that helped. None of that has managed to offset this situation right here because Ukraine's problem from the very get-go has been manpower. And that is a problem which cannot be addressed with money. It doesn't matter if you send 140 billion or 560 billion. You can't resolve the manpower shortage. That is the problem. Wall Street Journal, Germany, has secret plan for war with Russia. Well, let's hear it. The plan was drawn up by around a dozen senior German officers. Work on it began about 2.5 years ago. The 1200-page document sets out in detail how 800,000 German, U.S., and other NATO troops would be moved eastward to the front line. Let's stop right here. The plan says that 800,000 German and U.S. soldiers, it's mainly U.S. soldiers because Germany doesn't have an army anywhere near close to 800,000. Do you remember what I said just a few articles ago? This is the biggest challenge that the European leaders have not accounted for because they've always assumed that, look, the United States is in our camp, is in our corner. This is why when they started working on this plan 2.5 years ago, back during Joe Biden, that's the way things looked, which is why they've planned with the U.S. in mind. 800,000 Germans in the U.S. This is the problem right here. And this is another problem which the Europeans cannot seem to be able to offset right now. Not with Donald Trump in charge. German officials earlier said that they expect Russia to be ready and willing to attack NATO in 2029. But a series of espionage incidents, sabotage attacks, and incursions into European airspace suggests it may be preparing to strike earlier. But what do you do with Vladimir Putin's statement from yesterday? Just yesterday, Vladimir Putin has stated, as we've already covered it, that he's willing to put it in writing, the fact that he's not going to attack Europe or NATO. What do you do with that statement? Oh, you just pretend that it doesn't exist. You just plug your ears and close your eyes and you just push forward. And if people challenge that, well, then you tell them that Putin is lying. Analysts also believe that any possible ceasefire in Ukraine could free up time and resources from Russia to prepare for action against NATO members in Europe. The authors of the plan believe that if they can strengthen Europe's resilience, they will not only be able to secure victory, but also reduce the likelihood of war. This statement right here is absolutely mind-bending. What they're saying is this. Look, if there's a ceasefire in Ukraine, well, that only helps Russia, Jimmy, because Russia would have more time and resources to prepare its attack on Europe. In other words, whoever came up with this plan clearly is saying that a ceasefire is no good. Then why do people keep asking for a ceasefire? They're saying the quiet part out loud. They don't want a ceasefire. They don't want an end to this. Then the next part of their statement is very simple. Look, if you can strengthen Europe's resilience, that can help Ukraine secure victory. They're talking about victory. Nonetheless, my friends, I'm just going to leave this episode right here. I mean, after reading that statement, I don't think I'll be the same again. And I will see you tomorrow. Have a nice end of the weekend. Still, they insist on calling it a loan, pretending Ukraine will pay it back. Everyone knows this money would go directly into the Western arms industry. Macron has already proclaimed that if Ukraine receives these funds, it must buy European weapons. Weapons, not reconstruction, not food, not hospitals. And once more, Belgium is right. This would sabotage any peace deal. You cannot demand security guarantees from Russia while simultaneously stripping away its sovereign property to buy weapons used against it. De Croo warns that if Russia does not lose the war, a highly probable outcome, Moscow will demand its assets be returned, legally and rightfully. Belgium therefore asks the EU to provide financial guarantees if that happens. The response? Silence. Other EU members want Belgium to jump off the cliff first and promise, don't worry, everything will be fine. If nothing can go wrong, why won't they back the risk? On the battlefield, the truth is even harder to hide. A Ukrainian unit withdrew without command approval, exposing a flank near Huliepol. Russia exploited the gap immediately, pressing forward while Ukraine struggles under worsening weather conditions. Just days earlier came the disaster at Pokrovsk, routed units and collapsing lines after 4 full years of Western support artillery, HIMARS, air defense, long-range missiles, tanks, F-16 promises. None of it has changed the one factor that matters. Ukraine does not have the manpower to continue fighting. Money cannot conjure soldiers. It does not matter whether the West sends 140 euros billion or 560 euros billion. The bodies simply do not exist. Enter the Wall Street Journal with the so-called secret German plan for a future war with Russia. A 1,200-page document written over the last 2.5 years outlines how 800,000 NATO troops, mostly Americans since Germany, cannot field anywhere close, would be rushed east. This was envisioned when Biden was in full control. With Trump, the plan collapses instantly. The U.S. is not preparing to die in Europe so Ursula von der Leyen or Olaf Scholz can maintain their careers. Germany claims Russia may strike NATO by 2029 or sooner. Meanwhile, they ignore Putin's statement made literally yesterday offering written guarantees of peace. The West simply plugs its ears and pretends the offer does not exist. A ceasefire in Ukraine, they say, would only allow Russia to regroup before attacking Europe. In other words, they openly admit they do not want peace. They do not want negotiations. They want total Russian capitulation, an outcome more unrealistic today than ever. And then the final piece of insanity, strengthening Europe's resilience, will not only secure victory over Russia, but also reduce the likelihood of war. These contradictions perfectly illustrate the intellectual bankruptcy of NATO leadership.